18 minutes slated today because we got a lot going on, so I hope you're ready to listen fast, all right? Okay, here we go. First, just turn your Bible to Joshua chapter 22. You can kind of get a head start on that or get that on your phone or iPad or whatever. Maybe you've memorized that chapter and you don't have to do any of those. I'm not sure, but as you're turning to that, I want to share this past week, took a group from the 55 Plus ministry we have here at Anchor on one of the outings, and the outing was down to the Revs Institute in Naples. The Revs Institute is a car museum, basically, and it has all kinds of cars from all different eras and things. The Baron Collier family was the beginning of that, and they must have a couple bucks because there's more than a couple bucks invested in these vehicles they have down there. And it's pretty, I loved it. It was an interesting trip. They have one whole section of the building that is dedicated to the Porsche automobiles, especially the race cars and the history of the Porsche auto racing line. And they have the first Porsche race car was in 1953. They have the serial number 001 on the particular car that's in that museum. And that whole section. Then they have another section that's the history of transportation. Starts out with a three-wheeled metal bicycle they called the Bone Shaker because there was nothing soft about that. And it went all the way through. There was a whole other section on race cars, another section on all kinds of collections of cars. What was interesting to me, besides just seeing the cars, is that there were some name brands there that I and probably everybody recognizes. Porsche, Ferrari, you've probably heard of those. You've seen those driving around Bonita. But there were a lot of cars that I'd never heard of before. And it's like, what happened to these cars? Somewhere, somehow, somebody had this dream, they'd had this vision of having this, large automobile industry, and then somewhere along the way, like Lancer. You ever heard of the Lancer car? I really hadn't. Some others I had heard of, but never. Bugatti was another car in the past. There were cars like the Duesenberg. Maybe you've heard of that, never seen one. And what struck me was, what happened? Why did some of the cars make it? Ferrari, Porsche, all these other cars, Ford, GM. Why did some make it and some didn't? Somewhere along the way, they lost something. Somewhere along the way, they stopped connecting with their customers. Somewhere along the way, they outpriced themselves. Something happened, and now the only place that you'll hear about those is in a museum, while all the other cars are still on the road. I want you to think about the church today. Do you know of any churches that seem to have just faded away and have shut down? If you go up on the East Coast, first Sunday this month, we had Drew Thurman here telling you about the East Coast, one of the least church areas. But if you go up on the East Coast, New England, you'll find some beautiful buildings that are no longer churches. They're antique shops, they're restaurants, they're bread and breakfast, they're all kinds of things. What happened? How does that happen? I want us to look at a chapter today in Joshua chapter 22 that will help us, I hope, learn some things about what does it take to stay alive. What does it take so that the next generation will also continue to be around? Joshua 22, if you're following along in our reading plan, on the bottom of the back page of the bulletin, you'll find a reading plan. You'll be coming up to this passage. And Joshua 22 is one of those chapters, my guess is that you probably never heard a sermon on, and you probably don't have a clue what's in Joshua 22. Well, don't feel bad, because when I read it, I thought, I'm sure I've read that, but it doesn't really stand out. But as I was reading that, I think God sometimes just puts things on my heart, and that's the way I really like it when it comes to preparing a message. I read this, and something clicked. Wow, this is a great lesson for us today. Here's what happens. Joshua 22, verses 1 through 6. Then Joshua called together the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. He told them, "You have done as Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, and you have obeyed every order I have given you. During all this time, you have not deserted the other tribes. You have been careful to obey the commands of the Lord your God right up to the present day. And now the Lord your God has given the other tribes rest as He promised. So go back home to the land that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you as your possession on the east side of the Jordan River. But be very careful to obey all the commands and the instructions that Moses gave to you. Love the Lord your God. Walk in all His ways. Obey His commands. Hold firmly to Him and serve Him with all your heart and all your soul. And in the next couple verses, Joshua continues to go on and talk to them, encourage them. He blesses them. This is at the end of the conquest of the new land. This is at the end of all the battles. They're done fighting and they've gathered together. And this is a unique group. The Reubenites, the Gadites, and a half-tribe of Manasseh, they were given land on the east side of the Jordan River. All the other tribes were on the west side of the Jordan River. So they had quite a journey, and they were going to separate themselves from the rest of the tribes. And Joshua says to them, "You guys have done great. Appreciate everything you've done. Now stay faithful to the Lord and go back home and establish yourselves." So down in verse 10, this is what happened. But while they were still in Canaan, in other words, they were making their journey on the way back to the east side of the Jordan River, when they came to a place called Giloath, near the Jordan River, the men of Reuben, Gad, and half-tribe Manasseh stopped to build a large and imposing altar. An altar would have been something built with large stones that they used to sacrifice and to worship around. Where'd I go? All right, verse 11. The rest of Israel heard that the people of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh had built an altar in Giloath at the edge of the land of Canaan on the west side of the Jordan River. Now listen to this next verse. So the whole community of Israel gathered at Shiloh and prepared to go to war against them. Now what is all of that about? Well, what happened was they saw them do this and they made some wrong assumptions and jumped to some wrong conclusions. You see, the only place that was the sanctioned place to worship was at the tabernacle. This is before Jerusalem enters in the picture. This is before Jerusalem becomes the center of the worship. This is before Jerusalem's even part of the history. They had established the tabernacle, that tent which they'd carried through the wilderness for 40 years. They still had it with them. There they built an altar, and that's where they went to worship. And any other place to worship was seen as a blasphemy. So when they saw this altar built from the distance, they did what religious leaders do best. They had a meeting, all right? The first committee meeting in the Bible. And they had a meeting and they went and they said, what are these people doing? We've got to stop them. And they got so riled up, they decided they're going to go to war and attack their fellow brothers and sister Israelites. So they gathered together and they approached the group banked on the edge of the Jordan River. And this is what happens in verse 15. When they arrived in the land of Gilead, they said to the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half-tribe of Manasseh, the whole community of the Lord demands to know why you're betraying the God of Israel. How could you turn away from the Lord and build an altar for yourselves in the rebellion against them? They saw some things, they made some assumptions, they made some accusations, they came to some conclusions, and they went and at least they talked to them. But before they let them talk about it, they accused them of all these things. What happened? Verse 24. This is the response. The truth is, we have built this altar, but because we fear that in the future your descendants will say to ours, what right do you have to worship the Lord, the God of Israel? The Lord has placed the Jordan River as a barrier between our people and you people of Reuben and Gad. You have no claim to the Lord. That's what they were afraid they would say. They'd say, well, the Jordan's there, those people over there, they must worship some other God. So your descendants may prevent our descendants from worshiping the Lord. So we decided to build the altar not for burnt offerings or sacrifices, but as a memorial. It will remind our descendants and your descendants that we too have the right to worship the Lord at His sanctuary with our burnt offerings, sacrifices, and peace offerings. Then your descendants will not be able to say to ours, you have no claim to the Lord. They were afraid that not this group of people, but the generations to come, the next generation and the generation after that, generation after that, they see this group of people coming from the east to come worship. They'll say, who are you? You have no right. You have no claim on the God of Israel. And we don't want that to happen. So we've built this not as an altar to worship and to sacrifice on. We have built this as a memorial, as a statue, as a reminder that every time we cross this Jordan River, and every time you come across this Jordan River, this is a reminder that we are one people and worship one God. So that was a good thing. And it all wraps up in verse 34 this way. The people of Reuben and Gad named the altar Witness, for they said, it is a witness between us and them that the Lord is our God too. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to take all that. I want us to think about the church today. Is it possible, we're going to look at this in a couple weeks in the first chapter of Judges. Is it possible for a generation to grow up and forget about God? Social scientists would say that in America we are experiencing the first post-Christian generation. What that means is more people do not believe in God that do believe in God. And our claim to be a Christian nation is not all wrong, but it's no longer the majority. The church is standing at the crossroads of the future. And we need to grasp some things. We need to understand some things so that the generations to come won't rise up and say, what's this all about? Why are those people doing this? Or God, I don't know God. So here's some things from this passage real quick. Number one, I don't have any slides, but if you want to write these down on the back of your bulletin, you can. Number one is this: we must stay faithful to God in a couple of different ways. We must stay faithful to God. See, Joshua told them there, he said, you've done well. You've done all that's been asked of you. You've done all that Moses wrote and commanded about. You've been faithful to your people. You've not deserted them. You've carried out the mission which God gave you. And Joshua says, good job, high five, keep it up. The church still has that same call today. The last half of verse 5 summarizes it pretty well. Love the Lord your God, walk in all His ways, obey His commands, hold firmly to Him, and serve Him with all your heart and soul. I took the key words of 5 key things that we've got to do for our generation and the next generation to know who God is. Love, obey, walk, hold, and serve. Love God. Obey His commands. Walk in His ways. Hold firmly to those things. And serve the Lord. You want to put together a strategic plan for the church? You want to put together a strategic plan for your life and Christian growth? There it is in 5 simple words. Love, obey, walk, hold, and serve. And if we can do that as a people, if we can do that as a church, then this generation and the next generation and the generations that will follow will know what it means to be a people of God. The second thing I think we can learn from this also is simply this: relationships within the church and within the community must be a priority. Relationships. The relationship there that the children of Israel experienced was good and it was stressed at the same time. If they didn't care about the other people, they wouldn't have got up in arms about it. And relationships make such a difference in any body, but especially the church. But you know what caused some problems in that story? The wrong assumptions, the wrong conclusions, the accusatory tone of what they said when they got to them. But then on the other side, with the Reubenites, Gadites, and half-tribe of Manasseh, lack of communication. Because I may be wrong, but if someone in the tribes of Gad, Reubenite, and half-tribe Manasseh thought to say, hey, you know what, we better let them know over there what we're doing. And they sent a delegation back and said, hey, we just want you to know we're going to build an altar on the Jordan River, and it's going to be a memorial. It's going to remind us of who God is and who you are and that we're one people. Is that okay with you? Oh, yeah, that'd be great. And they'd go back, and none of this would ever happen. Chapter 22 would not be in the Bible. But that didn't happen. There was a breakdown in communication. There was wrong assumptions and wrong conclusions, and that caused the problem. Aren't you glad none of that ever happens in the church? Wherever there's people, you'll have those things. And I just want to challenge us all to do everything we can not to get sucked in to some of those, oh, did you hear what they did? Or what they decided? Well, they must have thought this or that or that. You know, that is, the devil just loves it when that happens. And then people making decisions, we need to communicate what's going on. It's so important. Relationships are one of the most important things in the church. And that happens when we love each other and we listen to each other and we care about each other. And we understand we're all human and we don't got it all right. We don't have it all figured out. We're going to blow it at times. It's so important. I had someone come into my office this week and they had tears in their eyes. They were upset. They wanted to talk. And I thought, oh, more. I wonder what this is about. And this person proceeded in tears to tell me how thankful she was for her church family here. That she had finally found a place where she could call home, where she could serve and love and be loved and be who she was, who God wanted her to be. That is great. That's what it's all about. And that takes work, that takes energy, that takes not jumping to some conclusions along the way. Let's be that type of people. Those of you that are going back up north, if that's not present in your church, you be the seed to start that happening in your church. God calls us to be His people, and we need to love His people. One final thing. Not only were to stay faithful, make relationships key, but you've got to keep the main thing the main thing. Some of those cars that are no longer a part of life today, somewhere along the way, they forgot to keep the main thing a main thing to produce a good, affordable piece of transportation. The reason they built the altar was to stay connected with their fellow men and God. They wanted the future generations to have the same thing they had. And in the church, we've got to keep the main thing, to love God, to keep Him at the center, and to always have a vision for reaching the next generation. And one thing I've appreciated here at Anchor, in May I'll be celebrating my eighth year here, which seems really quick and it's gone really well. But one thing I've appreciated is just a heart that we're going to focus on God. I know in those 8 years there's been changes. We've done things. We've changed worship. We've added staff and a lot of things. And I'm not naive enough to think that everybody has been on board 100% and they just loved everything that went on. But let me let you know that at the heart of all of that is one driving passion. Are we going to be a church that continues to reach the lost for Jesus Christ? And that may mean changing some things along the way, but it means keeping one thing central. The Lord is God, and He is the one we are to worship. Let us never make wrong conclusions and accusations based on the wrong stuff. Let us always keep the big picture important. That God has called us to reach those who have no relationship with Him. And that means along the way, there might be things I like, there might be things I don't like, there may be things that make me uncomfortable, there may be things I love. But as long as all that is centered on the same thing, on letting others know, exalting God and letting others know who that God is, then I'm on board. Because God has called us to be His people. To make sure that not only our generation enjoys all these blessings that we're enjoying, but so that the next generation and the next generation, as long as the Lord tarries, will know who He is. That He is the Lord, our God. Let's be His people. Let's be His church for generations to come. We're going to sing a song. It has a great message, great challenge, as we focus on who God is and why we are here.